Hello guys, and welcome to Field of Glory Empires. Today we're going to talk about the 3 resources that are especially unique to this game that are probably very confusing to learn, yet define how you will interact with the game and its other resources, and especially how you will win while playing this game. And those are culture, decadence, and legacy. All 3 of these things tie into each other. Let's start with the one that's kind of at the bottom of the chain, which is actually decadence. Decadence is a representation of the, let's say, the selfishness. Think of the lavish lifestyle of a king. Think of the Roman emperor's Praetorian Guard overthrowing him for selfish reasons and replacing him with someone they approve of every single year. For example, it's a collection of things that would occur that are self-indulgent, selfish, that contribute to the decline of the culture of a nation, or of a culture in general, I suppose. Decadence comes from a number of sources, but it piles up in every region that you own. The more regions that you own, the more decadence you will have, and it will go up very quickly. Because the bigger your nation is as well, there will be a higher base growth to decadence in every nation. If I take over 10 empty desert regions, that will make my decadence in my developed capital way worse than it would have been before. It also comes from certain buildings, as you can see here, decadence per turn structures. Different buildings will tell you if they generate decadence, and different buildings can actually eliminate decadence if you build them. As it says at the bottom though, 10% of accumulated decadence is removed each turn. However, it is fighting against the increasing accumulation that you have, so you'll never really get rid of all of it. There's more with decadence on other screens, but we're going to jump to the other screens later. I just want to start real simple here, so let's briefly talk about what culture is. Culture is, well, it's culture, but it's put into a numerical value. Every single region can have its own culture, just like it has its own decadence. Here's a good example of a building that will cover pretty much everything I've spoken about up to now. The monument is a building that will generate 16, for example, this is a different number depending on how many workers you have in the culture section and other buildings that are here. But this one in particular is going to generate 16 culture, some amount of culture, which adds up to this income of this number, which can be looked at as a nationwide number as well, which we'll get to in a bit. It also generates decadence. Notice the decadence number is pretty small, but just note that that 0.25 is always accumulating, and only 10% of it gets removed every turn. So it's going to keep accumulating. You'll need ways to get rid of it, like how my prison you see there gets rid of 0.5 per turn. So that's pretty important. Sticking with the simplicity for a second, we'll tie this over. Culture, as it accumulates in a region specifically, it will actually develop it. If you see kind of to the right of my cursor right there, it says this is a sophisticated location due to the amount of culture that has been accumulated. This is generating 5 legacy points per turn. What is legacy? Well, that's this number up here, which in the playthrough that I'm kind of taking this footage from, I have so much of it's actually spilling over under another icon. But this is legacy. This is your score. If you've played Imperial to Rome, then you'll understand this probably better as score. Although instead of just a random calculation, it's kind of a resource. You can spend legacy on certain events that will give you free units. Legacy can be a war goal that you could take away from your opponents. The legacy points that you can take away from somebody else in a war goal is preset numbers that scale up to a certain amount. The highest I've seen is 10,000. Maybe it goes higher than that. I haven't seen that yet. If it does, it is not percentage based or anything like that. The person with the highest legacy points at the end of the game, which it depends which scenario you're doing, but in the base game scenario, we're looking at turn 500, basically. That nation wins. If any nation gets 3 times ahead of the nation behind it, namely the first and second place nations, then that nation will win. Legacy can be granted by events, but it is also gained as an income, which is a combination of the culture accumulation of all of the locations that you own, as well as certain buildings that will specifically generate legacy. For example, a palace is going to generate half of a legacy point every turn. Some can generate 1 or 2. It adds up. Now let's get into a little bit more of the complicated stuff. If we go to the menu up here at the top, the nation panel, we have some information. Let me direct you to what you should be looking at. Number 1, we have progress and decadence. Look at this kind of like culture and decadence. Let's click that first. When they say progress, this is what they're referring to are these tokens that allow you to move between different stages of your civilization. The higher, generally, the better. However, if you start to, instead of progressing, go backwards and become old and decadent because you're not making enough culture, as that's how that works, then your decadent nation, your decadent empire, if you get that far, can actually just completely fall apart if you're unlucky, or at the very least, give you a big civil war that you're going to have to fight. But on the left side here, we have our historical culture value, which is a combination of 2 things. The absolute simplest way that I can explain this is roughly, not exactly, but roughly, the total amount of culture you produce this turn versus the average historical culture that you have produced in prior turns. Not every prior turn, it's in a range. So it's kind of like recent history. Versus decadence, this is just flat out your total decadence. This one is a lot more straightforward, and this is where it's coming from. You can see nation size, structures, events, status, age, penalty, and national modifiers. When I'm talking about national modifiers, it's talking a lot about civilization levels. If you are in certain levels, for example, a glorious nation, you could see with that orange text that there is an increase of raw decadence gain that you have to deal with. So the bigger and more prosperous you get, the more decadence you will get and have to manage as well. The lower tier ones have less of this to worry about. Decadence is more of a mid to late game challenge rather than an early game one. Then there's status age penalty, which you see is a huge part of the decadence that I am facing. Your age on your nation panel is kind of, well, it's the age of your nation. It's the idea that the older your nation gets, the more decadent it will become. There are 2 ways generally to lower age, 2 main ways that you can use in the long term. Number 1 is by achieving objectives. Objectives will be set by your ruler. If you go and invade those nations and take those objectives and hold on to them, you will find that you will not only get a progress point, by the way, but you will lower the age, not by 1, but by a good amount. I recall it's roughly like a halving, basically. Separate to that, there is a decision that will very rarely occasionally pop up that one of the options will be to actually lower your age by a preset percentage. I believe it's 1/3 instead of getting some other bonuses. I don't have that event right now, but keep an eye out in your events because you'll see it in the description. It has a nice tooltip to explain everything. So as you can see, the status age penalty is a huge problem that will really increase the amount of decadence you have. Then you'll want to actually increase your culture production, be it through different culture buildings, some of which can actually add more decadence, by the way, or by adding more population onto your culture production. The total ratio is not objectively relevant. This is relative because there is a ranking at the end of every turn of the best and worst ratios that exist in the world in this game at any given time. If you are in the top roughly 1/3 of that set, then you will achieve progress tokens. If you are in the bottom 1/3 of that set, you will achieve aging tokens. If you're in the middle, then you'll just kind of stay put, getting progress tokens if you take objectives, and getting aging tokens, or losing progress tokens if you lose objectives otherwise. Generally, you want to be in the top half. The top 10 nations for legacy, especially the number 1, are far less likely to actually get aging tokens and far more likely to get progress tokens. If you want to see that ranking not at the end of the turn, you can still view it right up here, the Culture Decadence ranking CDR, if you open it from the ledger up here, and you can see where you stand compared to others. As I said, green will be gaining passively some progress tokens, and then you have the gray or white, which is kind of just staying still, and then these guys, they're gonna have a hard time as they become decadent and old, falling apart into civil wars or just collapsing completely. In some cases, a giant empire next to you can literally collapse entirely into nothingness if they get 2 decadence and have a terrible percentage, just luck, pretty much. And again, this is all relative. So you don't need a 2.0 CDR, for example. You see, I'm in the green without even having a 1.0. It just depends how well everybody else is doing. And if nations are bigger, their ratios will be worse. You see, I have a 0.96. Look at how much that kind of goes up. The top guy's doing amazing with his ratio, but it's because he's probably super tiny. He's really tiny. Versus everybody else, you see the ratios are pretty much all under 1. It's relative to where you are in the game. And now let's tie this in with Legacy. Let's start here first. If we click on Legacy, we'll see Legacy is generated from a couple of different things. Your objectives that you take over that can give you those progress points. They also can give you passive income of legacy, so long as you have and own them. So getting objectives is a pretty good thing in the long run. They're not really going to start penalizing you at any point. It's just getting them can be hard and can involve warmongering, which can give you decadence. Culture can also generate, as we've shown, legacy points. This is kind of more of a summary of where it's all coming from. You can see kind of the different tiers that you have in your own nation. And then your government can have bonuses that can give you these points as well. And then there are wonders in the world. World wonders, national wonders that you can take over and build even, that can grant legacy points as well. All 4 of these add up to your income, which accumulates every single turn. Then decisions and events can grant you one-off bonuses, for example, of legacy as well. And it all adds up to your total. And now, when looking at totals, you can just go to the ledger, open up legacy. This will also show at the end of any turn. We have our legacy point totals. You can see the incomes and where it's coming from for all of these different nations. As I mentioned, the top 10 have bonuses for progress. The top 1 is the one that wins at the end. If you get 3 times ahead of number 2, then you just win automatically. Scenery change, different recording session, but I wanted to further explain to you guys about this 3-to-1 rule, the way legacy wins work. In multiplayer, you can set it to 2-to-1 at the beginning of a multiplayer session. In single player, you can do it in your options. You could do this from the options, I think even in the main menu, but you can enable it and disable it pretty much whenever you want. Click, click, it'll take effect immediately. If you do wish for a shorter campaign, do note this sudden death cannot actually happen until, you see it there, 100 turns into the game. So 100 turns have to pass. You got to get through 20% of the game before this can even trigger. So you don't have to worry about someone getting to like 20 legacy and then you have 10 and then they win. That's not going to happen. So regardless of what it's set to, you got to get a fifth of the way through the game. 2-to-1, 3-to-1, whatever is your preference. Personally, this is the one that I probably would set. Maybe not slower progress decadence, but like this, I think might make a more enjoyable experience to most players, but you'll have plenty of time to feel out how long you want in your campaigns as you try to get to 100 turns in single player anyway. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that. Back to the original recording. And you can go to war and use reducing someone else's legacy, taking some of it for yourself, as a war goal. So that makes culture, decadence, and legacy extremely important resources equal to the base money, manpower, and metal that we covered in the economy guide, if not even more important in this game. And it really defines this game's progression, how you play it, and just what makes it stand out compared to other games. Now, I wanted to make that as brief as possible while covering them all together because they're linked together inherently and they're all very unique to this game. Other games don't usually have anything equivalent to that. So I hope that this was still concise enough. I hope that this helped you. If you want to see any other guides on this game, feel free to leave those suggestions in the comments below. If you have any questions about this or anything else, feel free to ask that as well. If I can't answer it, hopefully someone else will come along and be able to answer it for you. For now, though, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.